Okay, thank you everybody, and welcome to this ASI webinar on our draft chain of custody standard, which is out for consultation at the moment. I'm Fiona Solomon, the CEO of ASI, and I'm really pleased that you could join us. As you might have noticed, I've started recording this webinar. We're going to make a recorded version available for those who were unable to make one of the 2 time slots that are available. You might have noticed that as you join the call, you're muted for the webinar. That's just to reduce background noise. We are wanting to take questions, and there is actually a chat box in the dialogue section that's on your screen for GoToMeeting, and in there you're able to type in questions either to everybody and certainly or to the organisers if you prefer. Sam Brumali, my colleague, will be monitoring for those, and at the end we'll allow 15 or 20 minutes to go through those questions, and we're also happy to respond individually for those that we don't get to, or if you would prefer it that way. So thanks again for joining us. So turning just to our preface slide, just a quick reminder on ASI's antitrust policy, which we do ask all participants to respect. So turning first, let's start with an overview of the aluminium value chain. For those who are familiar with the aluminium supply chain, this will be very familiar. But the key points, of course, are that there are many important steps from a sustainability point of view, from bauxite mining, alumina production, through refining, primary aluminium production through smelting, on through semi-fabrication, product manufacturing, product use, and of course moving into a circular economy, scrap collection and refining and remelting of scrap for reuse. ASI does address both primary and recycled inputs in its standard, and that's part of our commitment and focus on material stewardship for this metal. More broadly, ASI has set out its mission and its desired impacts for its certification program. Its mission is to recognise and collaboratively foster responsible production, sourcing and stewardship of aluminium. And secondly, we've set out a theory of change, which we have available on our website, which identifies some desired impacts. In the standards area, we want to see that sustainability and human rights principles are increasingly embedded in aluminium production, use and recycling. In terms of uptake of the program, we'd like to see the outcome being that companies increasingly invest in and reward improved practices and responsible sourcing for aluminium. And finally, in terms of reputation, we want to see aluminium continue to improve its sustainability credentials with stakeholders. And I put this slide up because I want you all to consider that the design of ASI's certification program should be seen as a means to achieve these ends. So turning to this slide, it gives a bit of an overview of all of the components of a voluntary certification program. You'll see that there are standards, and we're going to be talking about the chain of custody standard today, but standards are just one part of how a certification program works. There's also the assurance model, how compliance is assessed and certification itself is administered. There need to be a framework for who carries out audits and oversight to make sure that they're working properly. And finally, there's a framework around what members and certified companies can claim and whether, of course, ASI certification is having an impact. We plan to launch this full program for ASI by the end of 2017, and we are making good progress on all of these components. So you'll see those where we have ticks and shaded ticks reflecting that. And today's focus, of course, is the chain of custody standard in that orange circle there. So what are we talking about when we talk about chain of custody? What does it even mean? Well, it's actually one of some related or distinct terms that you often see used for efforts to advance sustainability objectives in supply chains. We might hear of responsible sourcing or ethical sourcing, supply chain due diligence, traceability standards, and of course, chain of custody. And chain of custody has been defined as that sequence that occurs as ownership or control of a material is transferred along the supply chain to a final customer. So that can sound a little bit technical, but the point of a chain of custody standard is to use it to recognise and reward, in the case of ASI, uptake of the ASI performance standard. And we want that to be able to work through quite a wide range of aluminium supply chains and final uses. So drivers and benefits of chain of custody programs, most voluntary standards programs for natural resources use some kind of chain of custody standard because it creates drivers and benefits for users of the standards program. It can create values and efficiency, such as reducing risk or providing a way to leverage those responsible practices that companies are applying through the supply chain. It can help to meet stakeholder or customer expectations for more information about products, or ensuring claims about sustainability are in fact true. We're increasingly seeing chain of custody standards being used to meet legal or regulatory requirements. And finally, it can create a platform for a global alignment around these sorts of processes and systems. However, chain of custody standards are not without their challenges, and so when designing our approach within ASI, these are the kinds of common challenges that we want to consider. They include complex supply chains. It's not unusual for aluminium. Many materials and particularly metals have long and complex supply chains with a great number of actors that might have different systems, different scales of businesses, different requirements, what they're looking for out of a program like this, and different ability to engage. The second challenge can be creating a critical mass or a scale of certified product to be available, and that takes time and effort to build participation across supply chains. Thirdly, cost, always an issue. Chain of custody processes can require some investment in systems and processes, and of course coordination between different actors in supply chains. And finally, we're increasingly seeing a very strong role for technology support to increase efficiency, to help address cost issues, and to enhance the verifiability of claims and processes through supply chains. And of course, we need to focus on ensuring they're secure and that there is equal access for those looking to use these systems. So all to say that we recognise these challenges and we are working on these, but I would ask you to bear them in mind as you consider our proposed draft chain of custody standard. So in October, we published both the draft standard on the left and a supporting guidance document on the right. The standard itself contains the normative criteria, that is what a company would be assessed against, whereas the guidance provides more information on interpretation, intent, and most importantly, suggestions for implementation. There are, of course, other relevant documents for implementing this standard, most notably a claims guide, what you can say about being certified and certified material. The assurance manual will cover off how audits would happen, and then there'd be more specific frameworks and tools like audit protocols that help guide people through the system. And just as a note as well, that the ASI performance standard will be reissued in this style and with some supporting guidance document by the end of next year, so that we'll have a common suite of materials. And mainly it will be the introduction to the performance standard that's updated. So turning at last to the chain of custody standard itself, it has 12 sections that have been grouped into 3 parts. The first part relates to general chain of custody management. The second relates to what is eligible input or eligible material at each stage of the supply chain. And the third relates to accounting for documentation and claims relating to the chain of custody system. It's important to note that some criteria are only applicable to some parts of the supply chain or in particular circumstances. So companies are only responsible for what they control. And how a chain of custody standard works is that a series of chain of custody certified companies join those together in the supply chain. So for example, a downstream user of aluminium isn't expected to apply the criteria for a bauxite mine. It's the bauxite miner who applies that for them. So this slide just has an overview of the key principles that we've put in place for this COC standard in our proposed draft. First and most importantly, the point of a chain of custody standard is to drive implementation of the performance standard. That's the ultimate objective. What we want to see is appropriate and responsible practices applied at all the relevant parts of the supply chain. Secondly, the chain of custody standard can be sought at either a whole of business or an individual facility level. So this is designed to give flexibility, particularly under a mass balance model, about accommodating inputs perhaps over a wide variety of locations and facilities, or instead, if preferred, concentrating on an individual facility level, whatever best suits the individual business. Thirdly, and importantly, it of course addresses both primary and recycled aluminium. And it focuses on the systems for the eligibility and flow of what we call COC material. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But for that material that's not flowing through under the standard, the chain of custody standard requires due diligence to be exerted towards what we call non-COC material, and also all forms of scrap. that are coming into the system. And finally, there are two chain of custody systems or models that we're proposing for the standard. The first and the main model is what's called a mass balance system, and that allows for the COC material to be mixed over a defined period and at any stage in the supply chain. So it follows that physical flow of material from their starting points, either at a mine for primary or at a refiner or a remelter for secondary, through to downstream users, and you would have a material accounting system or process that accounts for volumes in and out, and that's audited at each successive step in the supply chain. However, the second system that we're proposing and we're seeking feedback on is to allow for certified cast houses to allocate credits, which are a non-physical form, that is linked back to physical ASI aluminium that's produced at a cast house. And this model is being proposed as a way to deal with downstream companies that find it difficult to build an unbroken chain of custody under the mass balance system. And I think this is something we can anticipate to be a common issue, particularly in the early stages of uptake of this standard. So what are we talking about when we see COC material? We've used this as a collective term for the various forms of eligible aluminium that it can take, ranging from bauxite, alumina, liquid and cold metal as inputs into a cast house, ASI aluminium that's produced, and then of course eligible scrap returning back into the system. Another important grouping in the COC standard is the number of stages that we've defined. So we have primary aluminium covering from the mine up to the cast house, recycled aluminium likewise from scrap to cast house, cast houses differentiated out within the standard, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those reasons for that. And finally, post cast house, so anything in the supply chain that comes after the cast house, after which that physical metal has been produced. And we've positioned cast houses in the middle because that's where the physical metal takes a form where it's actually well identified. So let's take a look at the first part of the standard, which is on COC management. And it has two sections, one on just management system responsibilities, and the second on what we're calling outsourcing contractors. So the first one on management systems covers the general elements of a management system that would be used to implement the standard. And these are very common kinds of requirements for these sorts of standards. Firstly, it requires that the company seeking certification be an ASI member in good standing. And the reason is because that binds the company under our complaints mechanism and the rules under which the certification program operates. The company would need to have an effective management system for its COC that's regularly reviewed and updated. There needs to be a responsible manager, internal communications and training, record keeping, the usual sorts of things within a management system. And finally, some requirements for annual reporting to ASI. And that enables us to have some oversight of quantities in and out to avoid fraud so that we can reconcile across the whole supply chain. And it also feeds into our evaluation of impact of the program over time. So we would collect this data and in an aggregate form be able to review how the standard is tracking. So the requirements in this section are very easily integrated into existing management systems that companies would have, whether it be for managing sales or sourcing or inventory generally. The second section deals with outsourcing contractors, and what we mean by outsourcing contractors are those businesses that might process or treat or manufacture with chain of custody material, whether that's ASI aluminium or similar, under the direction of the company that's looking to be chain of custody certified. So while these outside contractors would be encouraged to be certified in their own right, there can be a range of reasons why this mightn't happen, either in the short or long term, or where supply chains are flexible and so on. So this section gives the option of being able to include these kinds of outsourcing contractors in a company's own certification under certain conditions. And those conditions are that you would still have legal ownership or control of the material, that contractor wouldn't further outsource any processing or whatever of the material, and finally that you assess the risks of including them in your certification scope and you determine those to be acceptable. Additionally, the outsourcing contractor would need to provide you with information on their output quantities of material so that you can verify and record it in your own material accounting systems. We're not counting outsourcing contractors as being companies like warehouses or transportation companies that already maintain segregation on behalf of clients or don't change material as they store or ship. What this refers to is companies that are undertaking some kind of transformation of material. And the idea is that this gives you the opportunity to bring them in the COC certification scope yourself without it being a barrier that they aren't themselves certified. Okay, so moving to the second part, which is all about what can be eligible input under the COC standard, what can be counted ultimately as ASI. And again, it's important to point out if your business is in these parts of the supply chain, for example, if you are involved in bauxite mining or aluminium smelting, then the primary aluminium parts would apply to you. And so if we think back to those stages that we looked at earlier, we have primary, recycled, cast houses, and post-cast house. And the final section in this part relates to due diligence, which everybody is required to do. So we'll look at each of those in turn. On the primary production side, the steps that we have there are obviously bauxite mining, alumina refining, aluminium smelting, and then into a cast house, which would produce ASI aluminium. Most companies in supply chains would be sourcing both COC or ASI material through each of those stages and non-ASI or non-COC material. And as we'll see later under the mass balance model, mixing of all these inputs is totally fine. So what this section looks at is what are the requirements for the individual company at these stages of the supply chain and what are the eligible material inputs, what can they count in terms of their reconciliations in and out. So the criteria in section 3 would apply to you if you are engaged in bauxite mining or alumina refining and or aluminium smelting. And the requirements are quite simple. They are that you would need to be certified against both the performance standard and the chain of custody standard to start or continue a chain of custody. And secondly, we've put in there the potential to recognise other responsible mining standards in future. So we've created an architect where other standards that may be out there or in development and where they're deemed comparable by ASI, that could count instead of, for example, the ASI performance standard. So it's important to say again, if you're a downstream company and you're not engaged in mining, refining or smelting, then these criteria don't apply to you because these upstream companies that are involved in these activities will have already complied in order to provide you with ASI aluminium further down the track. So the other starting point for a chain of custody, of course, is on the secondary or recycled side. So for primary, a mine is the obvious starting point, but for recycled, we need to define what would be the first entity in that part of the supply chain that would need to be chain of custody certified. And we've proposed starting it with aluminium remelters and refiners. So this is after scrap collection, sorting and so on. It's the point at which metal starts to be melted and put towards a cast house to again be cast as usable metal. The standard also distinguishes between pre- and post-consumer scrap. So, like for a mine, a remelter or a refiner under this section 4 must be certified against both the performance standard and the chain of custody standard to start or continue a chain of custody for particular material. But there's some additional requirements for the recycled side. Firstly, they need to determine and account for what is eligible scrap. So pre-consumer scrap that can be counted under the ASI chain of custody standard needs to come from an already COC certified entity. So what that means is, let's say there was a downstream automotive company that was generating what we call pre-consumer scrap from, say, a stamping process, and they were already COC certified, that could be counted under ASI, but not other scrap that's sort of 5 minutes old, that's come in through a non-COC pathway. And then post-consumer scrap would in nearly all circumstances be counted as eligible, of course subject to due diligence, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in section 7. So they're the requirements re, pre and post-consumer scrap. Remelters and refiners would also need to address money laundering risks that we see are evident in scrap supply chains, and they really boil down to recording supplier details and no cash transactions over US $10,000 or equivalent. So in essence, that's about applying know your customer principles to suppliers of scrap material. So they were the primary and recycled stages, and now we move to the cast house, which is a stage that is of course common to both. So a cast house takes in hot or liquid metal and usually adds cold or already cast metal as part of the casting process. It then produces aluminium in the form of what we call cast house products in the standard. And the amount that's counted as ASI aluminium will depend on the quantity of COC or ASI inputs coming in. Cast houses might be on site with a smelter or a recycler, but some are off-site and shared facilities, and that's one of the reasons why we have singled that out as a specific step. So cast houses we're seeing as the point at which aluminium is formed into usable, or in the case of recycling, reusable metal for subsequent material conversion and or manufacturing. The common theme that we've seen so far in these eligible input criteria is that the cast house needs to be certified against the ASI performance standard and the chain of custody standard. And in the case of the cast house, it also needs to keep records of batch or ID numbers of physical metal products that have been designated as ASI aluminium. And these are linked back, these are recorded within the material accounting system, so they're linked to the period in which they were produced, and of course the kind of aggregate input material for that period. Cast houses would have these recording systems already in place for both quality and other purposes. And so this, along with the fact that cast houses are common to both primary and recycled streams, is why we're considering cast houses to be the choke point in aluminium supply chains. So moving post-cast house, once we have that physical metal, we move into this stage of everything after there as being post-cast house. So that includes semi-fabrication, often multiple stages of downstream manufacturing, through to final assembly and supply of consumer or commercial products that contain aluminium. So we'll continue in this section now to focus on that physical flow, but later we'll also discuss, you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide there, the concept of ASI credits. So section 6 in the chain of custody standard covers this post-cast house stage. So aluminium, as we know, is used in a very wide variety of applications, including transport, construction, packaging, consumer goods, just to name a few. And so companies that are wanting to continue a chain of custody for ASI aluminium, firstly, need to be certified. They need to source it from another chain of custody certified entity, either directly, or it can be sourced indirectly via a warehouse or a trader, as long as that is not transforming it. We are allowing some flexibility for downstream or post-cast house entities to be certified against the performance standard later. So what we would anticipate is that downstream companies are pretty focused on the sourcing side, and that the performance standard can come within the applicable deadline for their company, which would be within 2 years of joining ASI. Okay, so section 7 is on due diligence, and this is the section that applies to everybody. It requires due diligence to be conducted towards suppliers of non-COC material and also recyclable scrap material, and it's focusing on what potential environmental, social or governance risks that those particular suppliers might present. So the standard outlines the components of due diligence, which is having a policy, assessing risk against that policy and mitigating where necessary, and finally having a complaints mechanism for any concerns to be raised. And this structure aligns with the OECD due diligence guidance, which, while it has been developed for conflict minerals, which includes tin, tungsten, tantalum and gold, in April this year, the guidance was extended by all OECD governments as applicable to all minerals and metals. So it's something that, while bauxite, if you like, is not currently in the frame, it's very wise for ASI to be proactive with addressing this in its standard. The COC standard draft also identifies linkages with specific criteria in the performance standard, because the question I think we could anticipate is, well, what should the due diligence cover? So we've identified that it needs to cover at minimum having a responsible sourcing policy, addressing anti-corruption risk, looking at human rights, and also conflict-affected and high-risk areas where that might be applicable. So this approach is looking to both support increasing amounts of stakeholder expectations around due diligence in supply chains, particularly for metals, and to align with ASI's mission to promote responsible sourcing generally. It's very important to note that this due diligence component does not preclude you from sourcing from non-ASI suppliers. So just a quick overview and rationale for the due diligence approach is something that had quite a bit of discussion within our standards committee. What is about is those process elements that I mentioned, which is a policy, a risk assessment and a complaints mechanism. It does look to align with requirements that were already agreed in the ASI performance standard. And for those companies that want to go further than those issues, of course, that's totally fine. And it can also reach beyond direct suppliers where a company has both reason and capacity to do so. So it's not setting a maximum, it's setting a kind of a minimum level that we're looking for under a responsible sourcing framework. So how would one carry out due diligence? Well, in the guidance, we do have some suggestions about how you could go about that, but the standard does not prescribe exactly how each of those steps should be carried out. It's really up to an individual business to determine that. And it's also something that we've seen in other commodity sectors that is likely to evolve over time. Thirdly, who needs to carry out due diligence? It would be those members that are seeking chain of custody certification. So it's why it's Section 7 in the standard. In fact, production and transformation members of ASI will already be implementing those areas around human rights due diligence, responsible sourcing policy, etc., under the performance standard. So there's an element of kind of cross-harmonisation there, but by including it in the chain of custody standard, it extends that responsibility to industrial users because they're going to be using the chain of custody standard to make responsible sourcing claims through ASI. And so again, why are we including it? It has become a fundamental expectation for mineral supply chains from a regulatory point of view and from a stakeholder point of view. So we believe that ASI needs to address this in order to maintain credibility in the COC program going forward. Okay, so turning to the final part, which is on accounting, documentation and claims. This is sort of the little nuts and bolts of how the COC kind of accounting would work. So the main COC model being proposed is what's called mass balance. And on this slide, there's some key definitions from our glossary, partly to show you them and partly to highlight that there is a glossary in the standard. So anything that is capitalised in the chain of custody standard is defined in the glossary. So in essence, mass balance system allows mixing, as we've discussed, and it boils down to a percentage in has to equal the percentage out. It also allows for a material accounting period, or a period over which mixing can take place, of up to 12 months. And finally, the material accounting system is just an internal management system that records both the flows in and out, the period, and any other relevant information on inputs and outputs. So moving to Section 8 in the Chain of Custody Standard, this covers in some detail how the mass balance would work. In a nutshell, it allows for COC materials to be mixed over that defined period and at any stage in the value chain. And the material accounting system is used to record and calculate those percentage-based inputs and outputs overall. So it needs to record those inputs and outputs. In the case of recyclable material, it would record a breakdown of post-consumer and pre-consumer, and it sets that accounting period. Could be up to 12 months, or it could be less, 1 month, a week, whatever is most relevant for the business. The input percentage is an important concept, and it provides the formula for both percentage in and percentage out, and that's spelt out in the standard. And a final important point for this section is that the output that would be designated as ASI is a proportion of the total, so it has to be a whole proportion. So let's say half of your input was COC or ASI material, then half of your output would have to be, but it would need to be in whole units. You could say, let's say you had 12 units coming in and 12 units coming in, and 6 of that was COC, then you could call 6 units going out as COC. You couldn't say all of your units was 50% COC material. We want to keep the flows as whole units, otherwise the flow of percentages through complex supply chains would be far too difficult to manage and to remain credible and rigorous. A second important point for the mass balance system is that we have constructed it to allow for both overdraws or positive balances to be carried over a period under conditions. So if there was an overdraw allowed, the focus here is to avoid it being abused. So we're only permitting it under what we call force majeure situations. And there are some examples in the guidance, for example, a supply failure or acts of God, if you like, in terms of supply, transport incidents, this kind of stuff, and where it relates to a forward contract for the supply of that ASI material. There's also a restriction on the amount, so you can't go into debt, if you like, for more than a small proportion of what would be anticipated for the input for the period. And finally, there's a restriction on time that the overdraw would need to be made up in the following period. On the positive side, where we have a positive balance, which could arise, for example, where the supply of COC material that you produce is higher than the demand that you have in the moment, a positive balance that's generated in one period could be carried over to the next. But again, that carryover balance needs to be drawn down at the end of the next period, or it would expire at that point. So you can't carry forward large amounts of positive balance over multiple years. Okay, so turning now to Section 8 was about how you control and account for internally. Section 9 covers providing information about flows to customers. So this is about how accurate COC information can accompany shipments of COC material. And in the Chain of Custody Standard, we call this information COC documents, and we've included a template in the standard and in the guidance. In essence, it really just sets out what must be included. For example, who's the supplier, who's the receiver, what's the type and quantity of material. And this kind of information is usually easily integrated into usual shipment processes, whether that's sales invoices or shipping documentation. But of course, you're free to have that as separate documentation as well. The COC document framework also makes provision for additional sustainability data, for example, relating to greenhouse gas emissions, and or other supplementary information to be included at the business's discretion. But it must be both accurate and verifiable to be included, and auditors will look at that as part of the audit process. This is the example of the template which we've included to help visualize what information is passed on. It's here as a sort of a separate standalone, but as I mentioned, it's more common to kind of integrate it into existing shipping or sales documentation. So, turning to Section 10, the receiver of a shipment of COC material will receive this COC documentation, and this criteria is just requiring you to check that the information supplied is complete, it has everything that was required under the standard, and also that it aligns with the shipment. You know, if you were supposed to get 10, if it says on the documentation you're supposed to get 10 tonnes and you got 12 or you got 8, then obviously you've got an inaccuracy there, and it was something that would need to be followed up with and corrected. The other requirement in this section is that the receiver should periodically check on the ASI website that the supplier's COC certification is still up to date. Okay, so what we've been discussing until now is an uninterrupted flow of COC material through a succession of COC certified companies. This is the ideal situation. And to source aluminium as a physical supply under the mass balance system, every step of the supply chain, so in other words, every entity and or facility that's handling COC material would need to be COC certified as per the standard. However, this is not easy to achieve overnight, and it's very common for there to be what we call breaks in the chain at any stage. And where that happens, under the mass balance model, the COC status of that material would end and it couldn't reach the last entity, in this case, a downstream industrial user. This is not uncommon. And so what we are proposing is to initially have a market credit system as well. And this is an area in the standard that we're seeking particular feedback on. And we have an FAQ available on this on the website. So the proposal is to have this market credits model available to post-casthouse entities that can't create an unbroken chain of those certified companies between the casthouse and themselves. And we're likely to see this in supply chains that are long and or complex, and where, of course, it takes time to build COC certification for every step. How it works is that it links a specific quantity of output COC material, or ASI aluminium, that's produced at a cast house and allows the cast house to allocate this as credits to a downstream company via a certificate. So those credits and the certificates, they cannot be retraded. It's a once-off allocation. And the idea is that it would provide an accessible and cost-effective avenue for companies to begin responsible sourcing programs. So in this sense, it's entry-level access to downstream companies that helps to support responsible production practices upstream as part of a transition to a mass balance model through these kinds of complex supply chains. It can be a very important driver of uptake because it helps to stimulate and recognise upstream efforts to supply COC material or ASI aluminium. And that's also common in a range of sectors. So we see this kind of model in renewable energy, biomaterials, palm oil, sugar, precious metals, and it's quite common to have a range of models or multiple chain of custody models, such as mass balance and a kind of a credits program, in order to provide this sort of transitional pathway effect. So let's have a look at the section 11, what the actual requirements are for those who might use the market credits approach. As I mentioned, it would be that certified cast house that would allocate ASI credits from physical aluminium that has been produced on the mass balance system to a downstream buyer. These requirements in the standard specify that the systems need to make sure that that physical aluminium can't be double counted, so it can't be sold as ASI aluminium, to a direct customer, and then also sold as ASI credits to someone else. That's not permitted under the standard. Secondly, credits can't be carried over. However, ASI aluminium, as we were discussing before, can be carried over as a positive balance, so a cast house would simply hold off on allocating it to credits. The post-cast house entity that receives these credits from the cast house would do so via a certificate, but that can't then be reallocated back to products. Once it's been allocated as credits, that's decoupled from the physical material, and we wouldn't permit any claims about ASI aluminium in products. So the claim would really be about supporting responsible production and responsible sourcing. The benefits of this approach is that for cast houses, they're able to allocate an excess supply of physical ASI aluminium via credits, and that helps to create a market for their own certification while demand for physical is still growing. And secondly, it provides cast houses and ASI as a whole some data on volumes of ASI credits as a kind of lead indicator for future demand of physical. So both of those are valuable. And from the point of view of a post-cast house entity, it provides a way in to the program while they're still working through what are usually complex supply chains. A bit like the template for the chain of custody documents, we've developed a template for a credit certificate, but of course you could use your own format as long as it contains the required information. The final section, which is lucky, sounds like my voice is going, covers claims and communications. So it's a pretty simple one. All marketing and communications claims beyond what's contained in, say, those COC documents or the credit certificates need to be consistent with the assurance that's provided by the relevant standard. So you can't claim beyond what the standard is actually requiring. And it needs to be consistent with our claims guide. So any claims about products or sources of material or practices in the supply chain which have an express or perhaps implied link with ASI certification, the requirement here is to follow the ASI claims guide. So CSE certified entities are of course encouraged to communicate with their customers and consumers about their support for responsible supply chains, but it just needs to be within the framework of appropriateness. Okay, so we've got to our final slide, and hopefully we've still got, yes, 20 minutes or so for questions. So in summary, just to reiterate again, the overall aim of the chain of custody standard is to recognise and reward uptake of the performance standard and to enable that to happen through a diverse range of aluminium supply chains. So we're seeking feedback on this draft of both the standard and the guidance, and some of the questions that we would put to you would relate to the market credit systems. What do you think the risks and benefits might be? More generally, is the standard practical and accessible? Does the guidance help to answer questions about implementation, or are there particular things that arise in certain situations or certain issues that need to be considered or addressed, either in the standard or that you would appreciate guidance for within the guidance document? The comment period is open until just before Christmas, and we welcome comments and questions both through this forum and also submitted to us for review. So I'll leave it there, and the process that we suggested was that either now or as we were going through to put some comments in the chat box, and Sam, who has been listening in and hopefully monitoring that, is going to offer some questions forward. Sam.
Thanks, Fiona. Yes, we did receive a couple of questions. One is in relation to the due diligence review in Section 7, and the question is, how far up the supply chain does the due diligence review need to be applied? For instance, does it need to go beyond your direct suppliers?
Okay, so under the draft standard, we've proposed that the direct suppliers is a minimum, but of course a company could choose to go further. And certainly I'm aware of some companies that have over time looked to implement this and sought to further understand risks and so on, further up supply chains. But under this draft, no, it's just to direct suppliers.
Okay, thank you. There was another question in relation to the ASI credits. The question is, if the ASI credits cannot be allocated to physical products, does it mean post-cast house entities cannot sell ASI certified products if they buy ASI credits?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good question. So the credits are decoupled from physical aluminium, and so once that's happened, it can't be allocated back, it can't be transferred back to physical aluminium. So if a downstream, let's say a car company, was buying ASI credits from a cast house, what they can say is that it's a sourcing claim, that they've sourced these amounts of credits and they've therefore supported responsible production upstream, but they then can't take those credits and allocate it, you know, for example, to say, and therefore our alloy wheels are ASI aluminium, because that is not accurate. So it really focuses it back on sourcing as an input and supporting responsible production, but not then reallocating it back to physical products.
Just another one on the market credit system.
Mm-hmm.
Is the market credit system only an interim solution? And if so, how long do we anticipate this being in place?
That's a question that hasn't been resolved within the Standards Committee. It's certainly something that we want to start with, and then we can monitor through our impacts program and through the data that we collect on volumes of both physical and credits to see how long we would need to have that in place. Looking at other programs, we see that it's been introduced or put as a companion model, say alongside mass balance and also other types of chain of custody model, including segregation or identity preservation, and they've continued to keep that there because these programs are continuing to grow, and in many ways you often there are new entrants, and so you need those entrance pathways for the new entrants as well. But ultimately, it's something that in the longer term, we would like to kind of see superseded. But it's quite likely that these things take quite an amount of time to grow and scale, and this maintains a role as being a feeder as part of that process as new people and new parts of the supply chain join that process.
Thank you, Fiona. One question on the mass balance approach. There's a comment leading to the question saying that there's no % limit on the mass balance approach. Is there a minimum, and how is this addressed in the claims guidance?
Yes, we did have some discussions about having a minimum input, but in the end, we decided that sometimes small percentages of inputs may still relate to large volumes, and setting an input limit was somewhat arbitrary. In terms of claims, because as we had in that slide, just might go up to it actually, that there's not a percentage-based, this one, where there's not a percentage-based output, so you don't have 50% of COC material and then by the time it gets down to the bottom it's 1%. Because you're talking about whole units, the percentage kind of side of that, you are going to have diminishing volumes, if you like, or quantities as you go through supply chains, but that may still be a relevant amount for someone. So really with the claims stuff, the claims guide will be requiring that those claims be accurate and verifiable, and it will be up to individual companies really whether, talking about I've got, 1% of my production is ASI or cans in this particular market, can be counted as ASI aluminium. That will be up to the individual business to decide whether that's a kind of a reasonable type of claim or one that has enough sort of flow through to kind of support consistently over the longer sort of time frame. So we leave it to the individual business to decide what and when they would communicate, but the important thing is that it must be true and accurate and supported by what the both standards spell out in terms of requirements.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. There's two other questions. These are general in nature. One is asking about what the process will be once this current consultation period ends.
So we will review all the comments that we receive as part of the consultation process with the Standards Committee, and we will also post on the ASI website a copy of all the comments that we do receive and how ASI has responded to them in the next draft of the standard. So there will be a draft 4 and a further consultation period on that mid-next year. So that will be the stage. So there'll be a further opportunity to comment, and then we will look to finalise the standard as in time for and as part of the launch of the program at the end of next year.
Great. And the last question is whether the presentation will be available for downloading after the webinar.
Yes,
I know we're recording.
Yes, we're recording, and apologies, I sort of mentioned as well that the presentation will be available. So we will pop that up on the website and include a link in our next newsletter as well. And as we mentioned, one of the recordings, either today's or Thursday's, will be put on the website as well.
Okay, are there any other questions?
No. Well, I encourage you to have a read of the standard or get in touch with us with any comments or questions. If you have particular things that you'd like to discuss, we're happy to try and make a time with you to talk one-on-one. But I'd like to thank you again for making some time to join us today and to find out a bit more about our chain of custody standard, and yes, welcome your input into the process. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day/evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Fiona.